Today we are talking with Miwako, who I don't think needs much of an introduction, but about archiving this particular practice and this particular couple in terms of their work. So we want these things to be very open and collaborative and participatory. So please feel free to ask questions at any moment during the presentation. Miwako is someone I've known for a very long time. Again, as I said, I don't think she needs much of an introduction, but for those of you who, for some strange reason, don't know who she is, Miwako has a long and storied career in the arts. Right now, she is the Consulting Curator of the Reversible Destiny Foundation, a foundation established in New York by Arakawa and Madeline Gins, which is what we'll hear about today. She's also Co-Director of PoNJA-GenKon, which, if you're involved in scholarship relating to primarily post-war Japanese art, it is the go-to place for that kind of network and that kind of scholarship. It's an online network of scholars, curators, and artists focusing on that period. Also, formerly director of the gallery at the Japan Society and curator of contemporary art at the Asia Society. In both places she did a myriad exhibitions, and most recently I just saw her do an exhibition in Hong Kong called Love Long with Robert Indiana and artists from Asia. It was called, that wasn't Earthly, it's called Robert Indiana and Asia. But anyway, an interesting experiment for you to look at a contemporary artist from the United States whose work you didn't know intimately, and marry him or bring him in contact with artists from Asia. So a very interesting exhibition. But after, right now I'm just going to welcome you and hand it over to you. What we'll do is you'll speak for about a half an hour, maybe.
So it'll be like very quick kind of showing of the images.
Yeah,
and
but
then we'll have more conversation.
Yeah, and then we'll have conversation afterwards, or just feel it as you go through.
Okay.
But really want the conversation, and if you do not ask questions, Genru, I will call on you. Okay, but that's true. I know it's just Genru. I'm not just putting it right. I'm calling on you too now. Okay. Okay.
And I'm very well supported because two of my colleagues from the Reversible Destiny Foundation are here.
Okay, great.
Stephen Hepworth and Amara, who are working together with me on various materials of Arakawa Gins.
Yeah, exactly right. So we hope this is a...
This is the opportunity to ask any questions.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much,
Thank
Miwako.
you for being here. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jane, for kind introduction and providing me with this opportunity to speak about these materials and really fascinating artists, Arakawa and Gins. And I have to admit that I am still very much a student of their materials, and there are many, many things that are still need to be further studied and researched, interpreted, reinterpreted. And so the first disclaimer to give today before I start saying anything is that if I were to follow Arakawa Gins' motto, the essence of their motto, once I finish this presentation, I will have to go back and say that, well, whatever I said a minute ago is all in the past. I have to start back again. So there is this kind of like a constant questioning, re-questioning, reposing of questions that were happening throughout Arakawa Gins' career. So they're really fascinating artists coming from this kind of inquisitive mindset. So what I'm going to do today is because I have half an hour and I have lots of images, I'm just going to quickly go through Arakawa, go through and sort of unpack what enigmas are within mostly Arakawa's works. So another disclaimer I have to say now is that I am still trying to grapple with this idea of a unique collaboration between the two. Shusaku Arakawa and Madeline Gins. So I might sometimes refer to works as by Arakawa and sometimes mention also Madeline, but it's because in terms of paintings, they are executed actually by Arakawa and with some assistants. So when I show paintings, they are physically created by Arakawa. So, Shusaku Arakawa. I know there are people in this audience who know him intimately. Some of you knew them while they were still with us, so I'm not going to talk too much about details, but he was, for instance, quite well-known artist, as proved with this front cover from Art News May 1980 issue. This is perhaps one of the first times when an artist originally from Japan graced the cover of such a major respected art magazine. So he was at that kind of caliber in 1980s. But as you can tell, it says Arakawa unraveling an enigma. So already people were starting to question, okay, who is he, and what kind of artist is he? And the biggest enigma is that what are his artworks? Like when you see his artworks, they seem very, very esoteric and mysterious. So let's try to decipher these three-pronged enigmas. So Arakawa Shusaku Arakawa was born in 1936 in Nagoya in Aichi Prefecture, which is about 160 miles west of Tokyo. So if you were to take Shinkansen bullet train, it would take about a little less than 2 hours. So that's the distance. But it's one of like fourth most populated cities in Japan. So it's not at all a countryside. He comes from that kind of more developed metropolitan area. He was a pretty kind of curious child who, at the age of about 8 and 10, he became really close to his neighbor who operated a small downtown clinic. And he really took Arakawa on as almost like a child assistant. So Arakawa became kind of intimately exposed to that medical kind of environment where like weird looking equipments are scattered around in the space. And it so happens that this doctor's wife was an amateur painter. So when Arakawa told the doctor and his wife that he's very much interested in becoming a doctor when he grows up, they encouraged him to study drawing so that he can learn anatomy from drawing. So that's when Arakawa first picked up the pencil and pen to start practicing drawing, draftsmanship. While he was starting to experiment with his artistic skill, it so happens that he already had very sophisticated, like he was very dexterous with his hands. So he was encouraged to go to a high school with very good art courses. So he entered a high school called Asahigaoka High School. And I'm mentioning this just because this is a very well-known high school. And I only learned this through Arakawa's history. It's one of the top 3 high schools in the nation, in Japan, and they produced many graduates who then moved into places like Tokyo University, Kyoto National University, etc., etc. And besides Arakawa, perhaps one of the most famous graduates from this high school is Genpei Akasegawa. If you have seen MoMA's Tokyo exhibition several years ago, Akasegawa was really like highlighted in the avant-garde art scene of Tokyo in 1960s. So the high school itself was very kind of liberal field of provided liberal education for students. So Arakawa comes from that sort of cultural and educational background. But when he was doing, taking art courses at the high school, this was the kind of, style he was practicing. Like any other starting, aspiring artist, he was trying out with these kind of figurative paintings, more like academic style, and nothing really too avant-garde.
How old was he in 1952? Do we know?
He was born in 1936.
Yeah.
So
16.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. So yes, please
Thank
ask
you.
questions. I have, it's like, voices are multiplied to answer. So, So he continued his pursuit to become an artist. Then he eventually moved to Tokyo and then entered one of the top art schools in Tokyo called Musashino Art University in 1956. Tokyo then was still today is a mecca of art and culture. So obviously he aimed to make his name in the metropolitan area. But when he got there, he was sort of disappointed because academic art education was too stuffy, too conventional for him. He didn't really want to take those conventional classes, so he dropped out quite soon after he moved to Tokyo. So what he started to do afterwards is that he started to kind of hunt around his environment in like post-war Japan, kind of found these like junk materials to create something like object paintings and relief sculptures, etc., etc. So this is one of the images from the 1960 exhibition that took place at Tokyo Metropolitan Museum in Ueno area, which annually had a non-juried exhibition open for anybody to submit work. So this is one record of his very, very early work. As you can see, and then as with any other artist works from this period, nobody really kept works from this time. So we don't have any of these early works, but you can kind of start to see that he's already utilizing these kind of wire mesh background with the mixture of like a kind of clay or cement-like material to make the object. And around the same time, in 1960, he became one of the key founding members of the avant-garde art group in Tokyo called Neo-Dada Organizers. So on this large picture, you see him right here with an umbrella, surrounded by his colleagues who created this organizer group. You might recognize far right, who is has mohawk haircut. He is Shinohara Ushio, who is a New York-based artist today. He lives in Brooklyn. He is the artist of the boxing painting fame. He has been featured in various kind of post-war pop art exhibitions. So this was a group that really kind of led the avant-garde scenes in central Tokyo at the time. And this is another kind of glimpse of the history where it's an announcement of the gathering of these artists that took place in central Tokyo area, Shinjuku. They usually gathered around in one of the founding member artists' studio, which they lovingly called White House, because it was a kind of unusual white modern looking house in the middle of kind of still, not so clean Tokyo neighborhood, and which was actually the first private residential building designed by famed architect Arada Isozaki. So there's all these like amazing personalities of the post-war 50s Japan were really kind of coming together to really discuss exciting ideas that will break away from the conventions. And it was the right moment for post-war Japan because everything was flattened. History was kind of destroyed. Everything was new to artists, especially young artists, to create a new. And so Arakawa continued to experiment with unconventional materials, and he is perhaps most well known for the production of a series of sculpture objects, now so-called coffin series. And this is one example which was exhibited at one of his early solo exhibitions in Tokyo's commercial gallery, called Einstein Between Matter Structure and Fainted Sound, 58-59. So these are the things that he was creating. And when this show opened in Tokyo, it really caused a sensation amongst critics. Mostly because they didn't know what to make of it. They just didn't know how to describe it, how to understand it. So it just became a news of the town. And when Mudo Gallery did this show, they published a very small, kind of skinny brochure with text by the curator Jun Ebara, and which caught an eye of the leading art critic of the time, Tono Yoshiaki, and he then grabbed one copy, he mailed it to Leo Castelli.
Oh, cool.
He said that, well, dear Leo, this is one of the amazing artists, like exciting artists, what's happening in Tokyo, and take a look at this artist. So Arakawa was already kind of introduced to the, international art scene, and then thinking about late 50s, early 60s, New York was really becoming the kind of magnet for, artists with really experimental minds. So when Arakawa became so successful in Tokyo, this actually caused a friction amongst the members of the Neo-Dadaism organizers, because Japan is still kind of operating with this kind of harmonious group mentality. Once they create an artist organization, which there were many in 50s and 60s, you are supposed to work together. But Arakawa kind of stood on his own ground, became successful on his own. He probably didn't do it intentionally, but he just became known as a solo artist. So the group members didn't like it. Mm-hmm. And Arakawa was encouraged by other, non-group artists and critics surrounding him to look outside. Tokyo is not the only place to work as an artist. For instance, look at New York. And so that became his kind of motivation to look broader world other than just being in Japan. So now comes the transition from Tokyo to international art scene. That was New York. And one place that he, I think, naturally aimed to move to was New York, where Marcel Duchamp lived. Oh. And that connection and introduction came from one of the leading poets and art critics in Tokyo named Shuzo Takiguchi, who was the granddaddy of surrealism in Japan from the pre-war period. So Takiguchi provided contact for Arakawa to Marcel Duchamp even before Arakawa moved to New York. So they started correspondence. Arakawa would be writing in English, broken English. He would ask Takiguchi to correct his English, and what Arakawa did was he would just send that letter with corrections, like red pen markings, just straight to Duchamp. He didn't even clean it up. So Duchamp, obviously, when he received these letters from this unknown artist, to his perspective, with all these corrections in English, who is he? Arakawa. So actually, that name stuck to Duchamp's mind, apparently. So when eventually Arakawa moved to New York, he arrived in New York on exactly December 28th, 1961. Famous story goes that he had $14 in his pocket and Duchamp's telephone number in his left hand. So immediately at JFK, he would pick up the public phone and dial the number, this way, I guess. And then here comes Teeny answered the phone, Duchamp's wife. And Teeny recognized his name, Arakawa, from the strange letters that her husband was receiving. So she put him on the phone, and Duchamp answered oh, Arakawa, you're here in New York. Okay, let's meet at Washington Square Park. I will be wearing a green coat with a hat. Find me at the chess desk. Right, of course it's Duchamp. So that's the legendary story. Yeah, whether it's exactly true or not, who can tell, but that's how Arakawa remembers. That's how Arakawa remembers the transition from Tokyo to New York and the importance of the presence of Duchamp. So that kind of inspiration that he was already feeling seeps through into Arakawa's the entire career. I think Duchamp's presence and influence is always tangentially there, whether Arakawa was following Duchamp's kind of way of questioning the retinal, like art for the eyes, or whether Arakawa kind of rebelled against it and really examine closely what paintings can do visually is, up to us to really decipher by closely looking at his paintings. So, this is a famous picture of, meeting. Well, they've known each other already by this time, but this is a snapshot from 1966. So Arakawa, it's quite amazingly, Arakawa was picked up by Duan Gallery, only a few years after he moved to New York. So the first solo exhibition Arakawa had was in 1964 in Duan Gallery, LA. And then, he would be shown bi-coastally, which was quite still unusual at the time in commercial gallery scene. And Duchamp would, go visit his exhibition. And, now you can see in the background some of Arakawa's early 60s paintings together with, I think, kind of like a sign book for the gallery exhibition. So let's look at some of the early works. So this is one of Arakawa's early works where he used a kind of like a shadowy motifs, kind of tracing the outlines of everyday materials such as shoes or hangers or sometimes umbrellas, etc., etc. And this obviously, if you just look at the stylistic similarities, it's pretty clear that Arakawa was looking at works like Tumu by Marcel Duchamp. And some of the elements that you see in Tumu, like bicycle wheel, and then different gradations of colors, kind of transposed against each other, or use of indexical signs, which is the hand pointing at one direction. These are sort of sign languages, almost like icons that affect Arakawa's way of composing his future works. Another clear influence from Duchamp on Arakawa is this probably last large-scale object that Arakawa created in the 60s called Diagram with Duchamp's glass as a minor detail. So it's pretty obvious that he is referencing all sorts of Duchamp pianos, and up there you can see he is incorporating the positive image of Duchamp's large glass, which is in the collection of Philadelphia Museum, but kind of recomposing the like top and down original structure of the large glass, and he's incorporating things like egg beater or even the staircase, like the different kind of scaling of the boxes, which refers to, for instance, Duchamp's nude descending the staircase. So there are lots of referencing to Duchamp. Another early example, this is another painting from 60s that incorporates kind of affixed elements, including a funnel, an umbrella, and additional kind of like a framed canvas with the printed image of Muybridge's photographs of series of human body in motion. With juxtaposed against Arakawa's use of these shadowy figures. So it's still very much in the mode of surrealistic expression. But it's also important to understand the difference between Duchamp and Arakawa. And I think there are, some differences. The key difference I see as I closely look at some of the images by Arakawa's work and Duchamp is that in Duchamp, for instance, looking closely at, say, the large glass, the theme of male-female dynamics, they are desirous for each other, but they never consummate that desire. It's that kind of tension between male and female that always repeated in Duchamp's image. But in Arakawa's case, there's always this possibility or ideas of unity, of merging, of two different elements coming together and combined together. So there is this kind of like a sublimation of the desire, which is much more kind of optimistic than pessimistic, for instance. I think rather than myself describing everything, I pulled this quote from Jean-François Lyotard, who is a French philosopher who befriended Arakawa, and he really articulated some of the things that Arakawa Gins were doing. For articulated language and its logic of meaning engenders in itself the melancholy of its separation from things and the illusion of a meaning that is always eluding it. But these formulations are too filled with pathos. An Asian, nurtured in the Zen or the Tao tradition, will recognize the familiar assessees in Asia's enterprise arrogance. It is rather knowing how to elude in the sensory world the appearance of perception and how to expose oneself to the enigma of apparition. These terms are also, I remind you, those of Duchamp. In the school of sensation, there is very little pathos. So Lyotard, quite clearly perceived that Duchampian influence over Arakawa, and I think it's this kind of illusion from the kind of formation of particular ideas or meanings of definition that Arakawa tried to always evade from. He always wanted to keep questioning. So this is another photograph that we found in the archive. I mean, there are many photographs that we still have to sort out. This is probably a snapshot from sometime in the 60s, Arakawa in his studio of 124 West Houston Street. So Arakawa and Gins met in 1962, and they had acquired the building on the West Houston Street and lived there since 60s, and until Madeline died. It was part of the foundation, and this is where a lot of the works were created, and Arakawa also created 2 films. One was entirely shot inside the studio space. Another photograph that we found, this is perhaps from the late 1990s, Arakawa sitting on his office floor with this massive bookshelf behind him, and really the office floor was covered with books. There were so many books, thousands and thousands of books, and was it like 6,000 or 10,000? 10,000 books.
Were they preserved? I mean, are they kept
Yes,
together?
no,
Yeah,
absolutely.
good.
We have
them.
them. Yeah.
We have
Very good
them.
collection.
And this is on the 4th floor.
Mhm.
So the one before is actually where they lived on the second
I
floor.
knew
Next
them-
in
I
into
knew
the
them and
third.
visited
Okay,
them.
right. Okay, so
I've been to
I've
the
got
floors.
photographs of you at a party then. And
No, that
the studio was
That collection
on
of
the
books is
first. Yeah.
important.
Mhm.
I'm so glad it's preserved.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to just look at anybody's bookshelves, right? But looking at Arakawa's bookshelves was like, I was in like a child in a candy store, so to speak, because you could kind of see the map of the artist's mind. And of course, having known Duchamp for a long time, Arakawa had many books on Duchamp. So this is more recent images from 124 West Houston Street, just as our foundation was trying to move out from this space. So these are last images of the office floor and the fourth floor, but you can see it's really lined with books. And
Well, Madeline was also writing, and the line, the string line with notes clipped to it, she would line these strings and put her notes for her books in different colors and different kinds of clips. So that's a kind of Madeline thing.
very
It's how she
interesting.
edited,
Thank
isn't
you.
it?
Part of, yes,
Yeah,
how
as
she
far as the
would,
editing process.
how she,
so,
yes, composed her books.
It's an interesting kind of very visual way of editing.
Oh, very
It's
physical and
very,
visual.
Yeah,
It's
like intellectual
fascinating.
bunting.
And here are two close-up shots of the kind of section on Duchamp and various other Dada and Surrealist artists. And since we have this like a general inventory of books that they owned, I searched just towards Duchamp, and something like 36 came up. So at least they had 36 books. Now, that does not mean that they read all those 36 books, but some were probably, given by, their friends who happen to, come upon Duchamp books, etc. But that they retain and they, save them. So definitely a kind of big presence in myriads of other influences on Arakawa. And looking back at, again, paintings, and I already talked about the differences that I perceive personally between Duchamp and Arakawa, is that there is this distinct separation between the sexes, but while in Arakawa's case, for example, when we look at a painting like a couple, there's this questioning of the differentiation of different entities, because Arakawa and Madeline as well essentially really examine our way of perceiving the world, or our way of understanding existence or existing. And then to them, that process itself was the key. It wasn't the depiction of the actual presence. It was the coming of the presence. So oftentimes, even if this painting is trying to figurate or create the figuration of a couple, only thing you see are outlines or words that are indicating where heads are or feet are or various other daily items are located within this kind of interior space. And it's all diagrammed. So the presence starts to come together in our imagination, in our head. So that way it kind of activates us as an active perceiver rather than rather than kind of passive observer. So this kind of engagement with their work is extremely important. And I think the presence of Madeline there is really important, because really the way they started to incorporate language in their work, and the way language become kind of mysterious but at the same time extremely poetic. It's the kind of sensibility that could be only coming from a poet who is the magician of the language, magician, alchemist of the words. And I think that fits really beautifully into the composition of Arakawa's works. And just to show you some of the actual physical Duchamp works that Arakawa owned, for instance, the famous work Pharmacy. This is the picture from 2009, so just 1 year before he disappeared. He was very proud to show this work in
I
his
have a comment
own
on that
personal
artwork
collection.
by Duchamp.
Yeah.
That he originally made 3. He bought in a store 3 common prints. He altered them with 2 dots and called it Pharmacy. All have disappeared, but the one that they had gone through Man Ray, so they acquired it from Man Ray. Just to let you know. And then Arturo Schwartz created a later edition of that print. That's the later edition. That was the only survivor of the original set.
The original one of 3.
That they
With
had.
the later edition, like there were like 100 editions, I believe.
Yeah, I think
so
Schwartz
that's
did
from
another edition.
1970.
But there were originally only 3, and Man Ray had the only one that survived of the 3, and they got it from Man Ray.
Well, we have to do like further research and to.
I have an auction catalogue with that in, and also a receipt for it, and it's for like 53,000.
That's not
So
the original.
I believe they purchased it at auction. That's what I have.
We'll
found
talk
in the
afterwards.
I mean, there are many. I mean, this is the thing. We're in this
Yeah.
Well,
constantly
we should
shifting
discuss
ground.
this because
yeah.
I know that it was shown at the Tate Picabia Duchamp Man
We have the
Ray.
letters
That
asking
show.
to request it and things like that. Yeah.
Right, but
Yeah.
so let's talk about the edition. I
Yeah.
thought it was the original of the three.
I think it is the original.
Of the three.
I
Oh, okay.
think-
Of the
I
three.
think they purchased it at auction.
All right. Well, let's talk later.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But you know, he at that time, by that time, he had the means to purchase Duchamp's work.
I don't think they
And
got it.
there
I don't
are-
think they spent that much. If you try to buy that, I know that it sold for. I think Madeline made $3 million on the
Yeah.
sale.
Okay.
So that means it went for much more. I'm sure they got it for less. But that's okay. We'll talk about this
Yeah.
later.
But there are other instances where we discover Man Ray's photos of Duchamp
I know.
and other work like this. Also another Man Ray piece that are part of Arakawa's personal collection of artwork. So I mean, like, there are mentions during one of Arakawa's interviews that he befriended Man Ray. He frequented Man Ray's office, and Man Ray would just like invite him to take whatever is of his interest, like a dream situation. But I haven't substantiated that statement yet. But who knows? We might be able to do more research. So, moving on to the second set of influence, moment of repose. Not to turn the narrative to the morbid side, but as we know, Arakawa and Gins eventually kind of made this statement that we forbid dying, right?
We've decided
have
not to
decided
die.
not to die.
Yeah.
So, my dear mother, what is it that changes me even though I die every second? Who do you think said this? Okay, it's a phrase that Arakawa, kind of like a paraphrase, Arakawa often referred during his lectures. It's actually a line from Leonardo da Vinci's letter to his mother.
Wow.
So, going back to 124 West Hudson Street.
The Reversible edition.
So, in terms of the number, in his bookshelves, Arakawa had over 20 books on Leonardo da Vinci, including replicas of codexes and books on Leonardo da Vinci written by various people. Sometimes like the duplicates are there. So again, we don't know how deeply Arakawa and Madeline read all these, but the signs are there.
Shall I wait
kept
till you
them.
finish? But I have to tell you, I've just completed an essay that we're going to talk about. It's called Da Vinci Duchamp Mem. And the Reversible editions that she just showed was published in 1881, and it was in facsimile of the holdings of the Institut de France. And it is certainly something that Duchamp looked at, but that's to be discussed.
Okay. So there's all these like interesting network of artists and creative people around Arakawa, and one obvious example of the reference back to Leonardo from Arakawa is the work called Next to the Last, and obviously referencing to the Last Supper. And another anecdote that is associated with this painting or this particular image, this is a motif that Arakawa goes back to repeatedly in the 60s, is that Andy Warhol, when he was creating his 80s series of Last Supper prints, he was doing research. He had very difficult time finding clear image of Leonardo's Last Supper. So he started to dig all the art history books, kind of like a coffee table type of books, and found Arakawa's Last Supper next to the last. So this is the painting that Andy Warhol used to kind of trace the outline. So there's this it really tells the atmosphere of the time. And apparently, according to Arakawa, he frequented Andy Warhol's studio, and he was very close to Andy's mother, who would regularly cook for a group of artists who visit Warhol. So Arakawa was, according to Arakawa, part of that group of people. And this is like an assortment of clear Leonardo influence on Arakawa from a series of magnum opus called The Mechanism of Meaning, which Arakawa and Gins started back in 1963 and considered an open-ended research project. And it came to amount some 80 panels with paintings and affixed objects and materials. It's really kind of composed as if a book and divided into different chapters. So, for instance, you see on the chapter 7, splitting of meaning, which refers directly to the reproduced image of the Holy Family. And then Arakawa is kind of juxtaposing different timelines on top of it. So it's a reference to the illusional depiction of figures. Next to it is, again, next to the last, we already talked about. And the third one is from another chapter, chapter 14. And this is a panel with 3 strips of mirrors. It's actually a reflective surface onto which Arakawa painted a phrase from a letter from him to his mother. So going back to the letter to his beloved mother, this time addressed to Arakawa's mother, but was dated 1915 or something. So there is this kind of skewed sense of time space there happening, and it's written in mirror handwriting. So again, it's a reference to Leonardo da Vinci's famous mirror writing. And the last panel is from chapter, I think, 8, Reassembling, and it shows 3 alphabets, ABC. And why does this reference to Leonardo da Vinci? And I came upon this drawing by Arakawa from 1970, which shows the quotation from another phrase Leonardo da Vinci wrote in his famous codex. Who is it who makes it anew if the maker dies continually? So it's kind of it's the phrase from his letter to his mother, and Arakawa is kind of creating these scribbles of A plus B equals C, and this relates to the golden ratio, which was the topic of the time in the Renaissance time, early 16th century, when Leonardo and various mathematicians were trying to come up with this divine proportion, and one of the mathematician whom Leonardo befriended in Milan is named Luca Pacioli, and he published the book called The Divine Proportion, for which Leonardo provided illustration. So there's this kind of connection between mathematician and artist/scientist like Leonardo during the Renaissance time, and the mathematical theorem that Pacioli came up with was A divided by B equals B divided by A plus B. So all this kind of trying to rationalize the proportion in the logical order is what Renaissance time creatives were all thinking about. But what Arakawa is doing here, in my opinion, is that kind of like agitating that sort of perfection. If they in 16th century came up with this mathematical formula for achieving perfect composition, perfect proportion, perfect ratio, let's try to agitate it. Let's try to question it. Let's try to come up with different ways of seeing the world as something that could be perfect. So that's the way that Arakawa and Madeline both thought about. Try not to fall into preconceived ideas, even those definitions that we associate immediately to our language. So there are, paintings by Arakawa that depicts the entries of alphabets according to Webster Dictionary. So that also goes back to this constant, continuous questioning. So So another painting, I'll just very quickly show a few more images. This is an image painting from 1970. Again, you see this quotation from Leonardo, who makes it anew. So again, this is kind of like a diagram of the letter that Leonardo wrote to his mother, and the letter that Arakawa simulated as addressed to his own mother. So dear letter is written at the top. But the perspective is skewed, color is divided, and it's kind of in this kind of messy state of being. It's not fixed on the surface of the canvas. So it's again trying to avoid the status quo or stasis. To Arakawa and Madeline, things are always in constant motion, always eluding the settled meanings. And here another example. I really love this painting. It has this kind of classic beauty to it. It's almost as if you're looking at some like really absolutely sophisticated mathematic, diagrams that were written by, scientists. Or something like this as well. This also has this kind of almost archaic beauty to it. And I would really, juxtapose this with the pages, any pages from Leonardo's Codex. It has that sensibility to it. So I think the influence was conceptual when it comes to Leonardo, but I think there is also like a visual kind of trigger when you see Arakawa's works. So, moving into 70s, his work started to become, bigger and bigger, multi-panel, and started to carry this architectural weight, the monumental presence. And obviously, when you look back at masters of the Renaissance period, art, science, and also engineer, like architecture, they're all kind of happening within the same creative field. So Arakawa was thinking in the same, multivarious ways. He would select inspiration from different fields, different people, different voices, and he would try to, I think, as much as possible, he tried to show that creativity within the medium of painting. And I'm actually surprised or astounded how long he remained within the field of painting, because where he wanted to go was so much more than that. But I think it's exactly that point that he pushed the boundary of painting, because that's what he did throughout his career, experimenting, examining, probing experiences and limit of material, limit of expression. This is another example. I'm just going to skim through some of the images so we can just have conversation. And then eventually, he comes to the point where, okay, things are starting to spill out onto the floor, onto the floor panel, not just flat surface, but like angled on ramps and on different colors and patterns. Viewers have to climb up. So things start to become really physical. The experience, interaction of the viewer becomes really the primary importance of the understanding of Arakawa. While you are climbing up, you face the painting hanging on the wall like in any conventional painting, but what you see there is very minimalistic. There's little visual sensation. So what you start to focus on how your mind or vision and the physical sensation is split between the two, and you go back and forth. You want to focus on the painting, but you want to focus on your footing as well. So you become aware of these like two entities trying to work together, but also counterintuitively not working together either. So it's almost like this like an outer body experience in a way. You start to observe your body as objectively as possible. So that's a very interesting experience, which this would be the last image I'm going to show. It's easier. It's almost like easier done than said. So if you go to site of Reversible Destiny, which is one of a few actually built environment according to the design of Arakawa Gins, completed in 1995, located in Gifu Prefecture in Japan. All the things that I said somewhat complex, somewhat, well, actually simple, you can experience it without thinking too much. This is the space you will understand what Arakawa Gins were trying to do, and not able to completely in the medium of painting, or perhaps medium of poetry as well, for Madeline's perspective. So it's like amazingly kind of complex landscape integrated with this surrounding mountain range. So while it's artificial environment with no flat ground, once you enter, there's no way you can kind of just sit comfortably. It's a space to make you uncomfortable. It's a space to make you into the mode of constant questioning, which is the key point about Arakawa Gins' work. And I, really highly encourage you to go experience this place. It's really playful engagement. I think this is where kind of essence of Madeline and Arakawa's work comes from. It's this kind of optimism about our ability to question, ability to survive these stasis, ability to break out of the confinement, and that's how I'm going to end my talk today. So.
Thank you so much.